Hello, everyone. Welcome to today's webinar. I'm Barbara Scafidio, editor of Prevue, and I will be your moderator for the next hour. I'm thrilled to welcome our four special guests. We have Hattie Hill, President and CEO of Hattie Hill Enterprises, Sherry Lindenberg, Senior Vice President, Marketing Communications, Crump Life Insurance Company, Cheryl Richards, Senior Vice President and Chief Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Officer at Visit Dallas. And last but not least, Leslie Zeck, Director of Meetings, International and American Associations for Dental Research. I will be letting them introduce themselves and their companies in a minute, but I thought we could have a little fun while I'm speaking. Why don't you type into your question box? We'll use it as a chat box and tell me where you're from today. And I'll read it out in just a minute. It's always fun. So you know, today's session will be recorded and you will receive a link via email. So don't worry if you have to miss part of it. And with all Prevue webinars, we offer CEUs for your participation. We'll be in touch with that after the event. Please do ask questions. We were just saying, don't be afraid before we got on this call. Let's make it a conversation. That's how we all learn the most. And we will hold a more formal Q&A session at the end. So I do want to take a minute to thank today's sponsor, Visit Dallas, for making this event possible. Dallas is the top meetings and events destination in Texas, with attractive benefits like accessibility of 2 major airports, more than 34,000 hotel rooms, and the affordability of labor rates 27% below the national average. Dallas is ready to make your meeting or gathering a success. So now let's start having some fun, and I'm going to turn the floor over to our speakers. Why don't we start with Cheryl from Visit Dallas?
Thank you so much, Barbara. Thank you for inviting me to be a part of this, the webinar today in the 16th panel. Again, I'm the Senior Vice President and Chief Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Officer for Visit Dallas, with 30 plus years in the destination marketing space. Previously serving as the strategic partnership person, and as well as in the media and communications area of Visit Dallas. I'm currently 8 years in the diversity, equity, and inclusion space in this journey, and I'm excited about it. I've been responsible for implementing, developing, and executing our DEI strategies and tactics to support Visit Dallas's mission, vision, and business priorities. I support all of our employees through their education, training, serving as a DEI resource for each of the divisions while engaging our community and external partners, and that's really key in this process. I currently work with our CEO to just make sure that all of our strategic strategies align in all departments and in developing external partnerships along the way. So again, I'm excited to be a part of this panel today, and looking forward to the discussion.
Thank you, and you've been a wonderful partner to work with on this. So
thank you.
I'll turn it over to another one of your partners, Hattie Hill. Why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself for the few people in the audience who might not know you?
Barbara, thank you. I am so excited to be here. Ladies, it's great to actually be a part of the industry. And Cheryl, thank you for inviting me. Barbara, thank you for having me. This is so much fun for me because this is an industry I've grown up in. I'm a 30+ year DEI consultant to this industry, running Hattie Hill Enterprises. Have worked with not only Visit Dallas, but many of the other destinations around the country. Did DEI work for organizations like PCMA, ASAE, Destination International. I mean, I've lived this life around the meetings industry, diversity, equity, inclusion, as well as being a past chair of Visit Dallas, as well as currently leading their leadership council. So I am so excited that we're actually talking about this. Thank you, Barbara, for bringing this to our industry. This is an awesome time to have this conversation. All industries are having it as we look at how do we bridge this gaping gap in the human divide in the country right now? And when you think of going into a city, there is nothing more critical than our planners to be prepared to address diversity, equity, and inclusion in every step of your process. So we are totally open today. I wanted to advise everyone to ask as many questions as you can. There is no wrong question. And I have committed to Cheryl that I will pull out my it's actually 33 years of DEI expertise, and it's all on the table today. So I'm excited to be here, Barbara. And again, thank you all for your leadership in the industry.
Thank you. And Sherry, why don't you take it from here? I understand you're fairly new in your role at Crump, your diversity.
Well, the DEI piece, I have been in my role at Crump as the head of marketing
For
communications and events and Crump is a national life insurance brokerage firm. For those who don't know it, we work with insurance agents, so we're not a household name. I've been here for 18 years. Recently, I was also asked to lead our DEI working group, which is comprised of 12 volunteers who each have a unique journey and passion to drive the DEI message within our organization and the communities within which we work. And I'm really honored to have that opportunity. But my DEI journey actually goes back much longer than that, to the beginning of my career in marketing and PR, when I had an opportunity to write an article for an insurance industry publication about the unique makeup at that time, and this was late 80s, of our Miami sales office that had colleagues from over 22 countries represented. And I did a story about how that impacted our culture and led to business opportunities and was also driving us to be the #1 sales organization in the country. That led me to being asked to speak on panels about diversity, which was ironic because diversity wasn't a word that I had used and it wasn't really an in vogue term at the time. And all of a sudden I became this expert and like, I'm just telling you about our work environment.
How that happens.
It was, but it was so fortuitous, and it led to me being able to get involved with a lot of what we now refer to as DEI initiatives, mostly at a marketing level, and infuse it through business opportunities throughout the years. I also want to share, though, that my personal DEI journey, aside from the professional one, is deeply driven as the daughter-in-law of Holocaust survivors, which has infused in me the need to drive awareness about basic human rights, freedom, equality, humanity, advocacy, and education. So I think those things fit really well and sort of at the intersection of where we find ourselves today.
Terrific. Thank you. And we'll move over to Leslie. Welcome, Leslie.
Thank you, everybody, for joining. I'm so happy to be with this esteemed panel. I'm Leslie Zeck. I'm the Director of Meetings at IADR and AADR. I'll bring the global perspective today, having done meetings in over 30 countries around the world with diverse cultures, diverse customs. And my personal journey, which I appreciate that Sherry shared, is that I remember many, many years ago, probably more than 20, when we were at an industry meeting in Dallas at the rooftop of the Hyatt overlooking this meeting, and it was the LGBTQ reception, and there were probably 20 of us in the room at the time, and I was probably the only woman in the room, and the guys looked at me like, why are you here? So we've really come a long way with that journey and our industry and the ability to talk about it, but we do have a long way to go as we look at other countries and the rest of the world and how they approach this topic. So we're looking forward to this discussion.
Thank you so much. And Leslie has graciously compiled a handout for the audience, which you can find in your console. Do you want to tell people a little bit about what's in there?
Certainly. I think when we talk about DEI, our mind immediately goes to race and color and maybe custom. But this is a little bit outside of the box for you to think about many of the other diversity, equity, and inclusion things that we need to talk about when we're looking at our meetings. So take a look at those, check little items that I compiled from a lot of different resources, and it's just great to have on hand as a reference.
Thank you for that. So who's in the house today? I love this part. We've got a neighbor of mine in Boston, Ottawa, Ontario, Fayetteville, North Carolina, another Boston, another Canadian from Quebec, Kansas City, Delray Beach, wish I was there right now. It's very rainy and cold in New England. Laurel, Maryland, Madison, Wisconsin. There always seems to be someone on our webinars from Madison, Wisconsin. BC, Canada, Arlington Heights, Illinois, many, many more. But hello to everyone on the call. So when we were deciding how to break up this conversation, it made the most sense to organize it around our roles and our decision making in planning our events. So the first segment we wanted to discuss is how diversity factors into decisions around program planning. And that's a very broad term, but what we mean by that is everything from your educational topics to the speakers you choose to the events, the networking events that you hold. So why don't we start with the educational topics and talk a little bit about that, and also speaker choice. There's so much to unpack there. I see Leslie nodding her head. Do you want to take it first?
I'll start with the diversity of a panel when you are selecting your speakers. And I'm laughing because in my handout, I say don't have a manel, which is an all male panel, traditionally white. But here we are, all women. But I think our industry is widely represented by women, especially historically, where the meeting planners were the ladies and the hoteliers were the men. But really, it's something to take a look at, is ensure not just on the panel, but in your marketing materials as well, that you reflect the diversity of who is speaking and how you're promoting that meeting. Hugely important.
Hugely important. And there have been, Anna Maria Ruffini from Site started a whole movement in Italy around boycotting events where the women were not equally represented on panels. So, you know, this is very real for all of us, having attended in this industry many events where we feel, you know, as women we're not representing, and that's just one represented, and that's just one small piece of the puzzle. So, Sherry, do you want to share?
Yeah, I was going to say I saw a statistic recently and from Forbes that in 2020, 2/3 of global speakers were men, and 35 to 40% of events had no Black speaker on their panels, which is just astounding. And as you said, those are the two things that we can easily see and identify. And then if you factor in all the other diversity components that may not be as obvious, we know that we're really not doing a good job when it comes to that. So I think it's important to engage diverse people and stakeholders so that we tap into diverse speakers and better design, as opposed to having just small closed groups of people contributing to what the program is going to be about, and get outside of our traditional comfort zones.
Right.
Yeah, I was gonna say, Sherry, I think you're absolutely right. I think I mean, we really have to be strategic about it, because we tend to I mean, just in planning events and bringing in your panel. I mean, you tend to want to go to your white males, but you got to be more strategic in how you look at it. So bringing in your stakeholders to be part of the panel is something that attendees want now. And so if you can find more people of color to be a part of it, absolutely, you want to bring in some of your stakeholders.
Well, and I'll say it's people, your attendees, no matter what color they are often offended if it's all of any one group. So there is an expectation, especially among the younger generation, that you will have that inclusive look within your panel. I had someone call me the other day. They were doing a conference for 2022, and they're like, we need a Black male, Hattie. And it used to be those kind of comments were kind of offensive. I'm like, okay, let's see, there's Simon Bailey, Dr. James spoke. I start just listing people, and they're like, how do you know these people? I started to say they were over at my house the other night, but then I thought that wouldn't sound good. But we have to really communicate. So if you're looking for diversity among speakers, absolutely send us an email. We'll help you, because we don't want people stressed over not being able to find diversity. I had that 30 years ago when the only person of color that they knew was Les Brown, and they said, you can't be successful as a woman because there's only one Black guy that can be a speaker.
And certainly speakers bureaus can help us with that. But a lot of us as meeting planners suffer from the executive request, meaning so-and-so was at another conference and they heard this speaker and this one's great, get that one. And you're like, okay, can we consider any other and maybe take the path of least resistance and just get the person that we were requested instead of going out and saying, hey, yes, that person is good on this topic, but here's 2 or 3 others that are similar, that are equally well regarded, that could be options. So I think that we have to push ourselves and not just go with what we've been asked to do sometimes.
Yeah, we do. And also reach out to, actually reach out to your cities, your destination marketing organizations, because everyone should have a list of external partners that they work with. In terms of just reaching out to them and saying, do you have do you have someone that speaks on LGBTQ rights or women's rights, or whatever your topic, motivational speakers, and most of your DMOs are gonna have a list of people that they are external partners that they work with that may be of color.
And I have a recommendation there as well. If it's not the subject matter expert, then consider bringing in a moderator or a facilitator of diverse backgrounds so that you can have that on the stage or on the screen.
And I said, that's a great point, because you oftentimes will have news, celebrities, sports people. You can have all kinds of options in your city that people will know and appreciate. That's a great idea.
Absolutely.
Also, if they are in your city, it's possible to get them a little more easily because it's not as difficult for them to do it. So Cheryl, do you have that kind of resource at Visit Dallas?
Yeah, so we have one of the things that we started several years ago was starting to put together what we call community leaders events, and they're made up of community and business leaders. And so at any time we can go to that list and look to see, we do one for each market. We do one for the African American market, for the LGBTQ market, for the Latino market, and then we have we do on a smaller scale for our Asian American market. So and so we try to keep that list updated so that we can always go. That's my go-to list when I'm looking for when a planner calls and says I need a speaker on human rights, or I need a speaker on, I go to that list to determine who I pull from that list, because they may know someone that knows someone. And so it's always, so I do have a list that I keep on hand.
It's great to know. I think CVBs can be overlooked as a resource, and I found them to be one of my most valuable when I plan events. And one of the first calls I make. But as I talk to our audience, that's often not the case. They just don't think in that direction. And so I want to encourage them to, because you're also frankly a free service.
Free service.
And you're there for them. That's your purpose. So I had an interesting conversation with Leslie about how to create like an advisory board or a group within your company, rather than making all the decisions as a planner. How do you make sure you're hitting all the buttons with your decisions? You want to talk about that a little bit?
Certainly. So we're an association, and global in nature. So we have members around the world of all diverse cultures and backgrounds. So of course, we don't want to look, and historically in the sciences and especially dentistry, all white men. But as you can see, the emerging availability of going to dental school and earning a degree in science and taking that even to a higher level of diversity it's available now. So what we look for is we look at exactly that. Our board is diverse and global, and we would never even put candidates against each other that were all white men or even all women. So you take that, your membership base or your company base or your local destination base, and you kind of take a look around and see who would be good in these roles and who can give us the best input so that we can make these decisions, not just me as the planner. So it's really helpful. I do it for local organizing committees so that I'm hitting local culture, local customs. I'm not meeting on religious holidays around the world that I may not be familiar with. And when Cheryl mentioned her database of people, internationally, there could be an ambassador program or of people who represent that destination and a specialty or a field, and that's a very similar resource. So you kind of take that broad reach and they help you make those decisions for your speakers, your program, your content.
And I'll comment on that, Barbara, because
Sure.
Cheryl has for Visit Dallas a leadership council, and it serves in that role, Leslie. So it's a living, breathing example. I chair that council. We consult with the CEO, the leadership team. What are some things we need? So having the resources in the community, large business, small business, people who've been involved. We have some past chairs of Visit Dallas, but we also have some people who are new, who could be considered as actual board members down the line. So our goal is to cover off on all of those opportunities to make sure that they're there for everyone.
Yeah, also including our, we've got our diversity, equity, and inclusion committee as well. That's a board standing committee, and so that committee is made up of people that are in the DEI space and community leaders from corporations, because we look at them as having meetings as well, and so we can pull from that, from that list of people too when we're looking for diversity. And I do that all the time, particularly with speakers, because they're willing and ready to go at any time because they represent a vast array of companies.
Right. Let's shift a little bit. We've spoken about speakers. A huge part of the networking at events goes on, outside of the actual educational program. And we are all charged with various events that are part of our meeting and need to keep them inclusive and need to make everyone feel comfortable. I just did an interview with the president of the LGBT Meeting Professionals Association. And for example, at IMEX, they are doing a special event around that meeting. So how do you, what's the lens that you use to make everyone comfortable when you are planning the after hours events and the networking events? Leslie, why don't we start with you?
Well, I want to start with the selection of the destination or the venue that you're using. And I put a few pointers in the handout that if you are able to do a site visit, many of us can only do this virtually in today's time. But if you are able to do that, this is an experience that you will see. Take a look around. Who is at the front desk? Is this a diverse and inclusive venue that you're selecting? I'm so happy to have Cheryl here with the CVB, because we're also looking broader at the state or the city, or in some cases in Europe, the country. What is the legislation that's being handed down and what are the controversies there? But if you have the teamwork and the players to put together to make all attendees feel comfortable, because we get feedback from our members all the time. Why did you pick that destination? They have this ban, they have this law, they passed this legislation, they're being exclusive. You need to make that inclusive and work together with your destination or venue partner to show them what is being done above and beyond that legislation that the voters are choosing or the legislators are choosing. So you may choose not to pick a particular destination because of what's happening politically, or you can build from it. So take a look, like I said, look at the front desk, look at who's doing your housekeeping, look at the age diversity within. Is it all millennials working in the lobby or in the restaurants? Or do you see that diversity, equity, inclusion all around you, from the airport arrival experience to the venue to the evening of? And you can pick and choose who your vendor partners are just by looking around.
So let's go down this track a little bit. Then we can get back to some of the other aspects of meetings, because I think this is a really important track, and it is right at the beginning of your planning. Are there resources where you can, obviously certain destinations are large and have larger marketing budgets and can really promote their diversity efforts. There are smaller destinations that are quite, exactly what you're looking for too. Where do you go online? Are there resources, places you can go? What kind of search do you do to evaluate a destination?
I use the CVB partnership exclusively, and that's the first start. And I'd like to hear what Sherry says, because I think then they will point me in the direction of the resources. I mean, if I need a bar or nightlife for a certain group of attendees, then the CVB can help point me there.
Thank you, Leslie. Appreciate that.
Sarah, what about you?
Yeah, certainly the CVBs are going to be a key part of that. I think generally staying aware of what's happening in our country or the country that you're doing meetings and events and in the news, and making sure that we're following those things and not getting caught in any difficult situations. But sometimes that's challenging, because you might be planning a meeting that's 18 months or 2 years out, and things then happen in that city that you need to jump in and address. The DMC, if you're going to be working with a local destination marketing company that's going to help you implement your program, is important as well. And then I also rely on I will rely more, because we've only put it together, but this DEI working group that I have, people just to say, hey, we're thinking about this. Any issues that I might not be on top of myself, because they each represent, and it's not that we picked each different area of diversity, but they each have sort of a pulse on the market. And it's sort of like a conscious check to say, hey, is there something going on that I haven't paid attention to in the media that would be a concern about this? So using whatever type of advisory board you have would be helpful too.
And I'll add to that, Barbara, because we've gone through it. Of course, here in Texas, we've had a very interesting time. So
absolutely.
So sit on the board of the Dallas Regional Chamber, and so does Cheryl's CEO, and we talked about this. Anytime, to Leslie's point, there's legislation, right? You start to get people calling. So immediately, as we had some of the legislation being passed here in Texas around gender, the phone started ringing off the hook, and we literally had a major corporation reaching out to his people in the company and saying, we will relocate you from Texas. So forgets to having a meeting come to town. They're talking about pulling their people out of town, and they meet here in Dallas all the time. So we have to be aware of what are the issues of the state. Then it's very incumbent on us to be aware of what's happening in our city, and having a close relationship with our city leaders has been really critical in this process. And then also, especially being able to go to these additional touch points. Sherry, I love what you said. If you have a diversity, equity, inclusion advisory group or an advisory board, because sometimes there's conversations happening that you never really know about. It could be around safety, just not ethnic things, but all kinds of other issues that could be in that city. So I would definitely take that. And then just the basics. I mean, these are marketing organizations, but your website, where there's information that should be listed that says this is a great place to live, work, and play and visit. And that's really critical from a marketing perspective.
Yeah,
I overlooked one.
Sure.
Sorry. I was
no, go right ahead.
As plug for you and your peers out there putting out magazines, right? The media, the online publications certainly need to continue to be a source of very timely and relevant information about what's happening and how our communities are handling different types of events.
And I was going to mention social media plays such an important role in what we do. And this, you could do this outside of our industry and outside of these publications and take a look at what the pulse of the people is via social media. You may not want to hear what you see, but it's there and it's real.
Yeah, I agree. Your social media is huge, and you've got to reflect the diversity in your social media platforms. And also, if there's an opportunity to have, because I can tell you, your young professionals are looking for they're looking for destinations, and they're no longer saying, obviously give me a, it used to be where planners were saying, give me your DEI statement or your supplier diversity statement. They want to make sure that you're actually walking the talk. And so they're looking for, accessibility landing pages on your website. They're looking for, how you engage as an organization in your community. Bloggers. I mean, making sure that you got bloggers, but you got diverse bloggers, and that's one thing that I can say about Visit Dallas is that we've done a really good job of incorporating diverse bloggers that can tell short stories about our city, and so just making sure that you cover the gamut, because you ask questions. Can everyone understand your promotion and communication of your destination?
The physical accessibility ADA piece is a webinar in itself, and I don't know how we even can start to touch on it, but is that rolled up into your roles, Leslie and Sherry?
Absolutely. Again, I have a huge reference there with the handout, and this is of personal interest to me. I have a sister that has advanced multiple sclerosis, and it really does require the accessibility. There are certain restaurants around the country that we can't go to, or she'll have to go around the back alley and come in through the kitchen in order to bring the walker or the wheelchair in. I also have a board member from Mexico, so flying internationally, paraplegic that travels with an assistant. So budgetarily, you have to factor into your planning things such as transportation. I need a wheelchair accessible van or shuttle. I need to accommodate her assistant who travels with her. So these are things that you absolutely cannot overlook. And especially in the United States, we have ADA compliance and we ask these questions in registration, but outside of this country, it's not always as easy, especially in the more historic, remote towns of Italy, for example, where you can't necessarily get accessible entrance into hotels or villas or restaurants. So it's hugely important. Don't overlook it, because that's the equity and inclusion piece of DEI.
Can you tap into DMCs for that knowledge of how a venue's set up, or is that something that the CVB has already delineated, Cheryl?
I would say both. I would use both as well. I'm sure Cheryl has those.
Yeah,
resources.
I would too. I would definitely tap into DMCs, because they're just as knowledgeable, and they're on, obviously just like us, they're boots on the ground with the clients, and so yeah, absolutely.
Okay. Sherry, anything you can add from your perspective?
Absolutely. We talk about our room setups, that they need to be comfortable. We might know in advance if we've got somebody who's in a wheelchair or a walker, but you don't always, right? People get injured all the time and all of a sudden show up at your event and you weren't prepared for that. But how about room setups that just can accommodate wobblers, right? People are setups too close together that as they're tripping all over each other, different size people, even the frequent break takers. Do we have enough room that people can get in and out comfortably to do what they need to do during an event without disrupting the entire program? What about accommodations for closed captioning or sign language or multi-language translators? That's not something that is something in my company as well, but for some associations that I've been part of have to deal with those things and the space to accommodate that. The other piece, though, is around signage and making sure that we're using signage and guidelines for best accessibility when it comes to colors, font size, type size. I'm having vision problems myself, and all of a sudden I'm like, oh my gosh, I can't read this. If I can't read it, I can imagine how many others are struggling with it as well. And then there's a psychological consideration about neurodiverse attendees who might be bothered by excessive sound or fluorescent lighting that could hamper their ability to participate. So do we have comfortable spaces where they could step out for a break and a little bit of downtime because of the feeling of getting overwhelmed? So there's a lot of different considerations to go into the design that we just might not have thought about before in our traditional setups.
It's almost like we have reverse psychology happening here with all of this virtual, where if you, many of these webinars that we've been on have language translation capability, they have closed captioning, and then it makes you look at your in-person meeting and think, wow, we should make this happen. People are so appreciative of having more inclusivity. And, you know, even though if a vision impaired person may not be able to see the webinar, there are other elements that we can do in this reverse way. But something as simple as staging in a meeting room and the height of a podium really have to be carefully looked at, because as Sherry said, you may not know what is needed. A presenter or a speaker or a participant may not include, maybe just to test you. So you rely on the venue for some, how do I get a wheelchair up on this stage at the 11th hour? Or how do I give some additional height on the podium and the lectern so that the presenter can be seen by the audience? All of these things need to go into your factoring.
I was laughing at that one because most podiums were designed for your stereotypical 5'10" male, and you
Right.
bring up a 5' female speaker in flats, like hiding over the edge. So those, I think we've all learned to get past, but there's much more than that to consider.
Yep.
So it's interesting because everything that we're saying here is really, so we're really getting to know the attendees.
Mm-hmm.
Really getting to know, I mean, when I say really, I'm saying really getting, dive a little bit deeper into, you know, who the attendees are. I mean, you know, as planners, you know, we tend to want to just move forward in planning the meeting, but you really have to understand who the attendees are that are attending, the meeting, and so that you can better plan and accommodate those that that may have disabilities, that may have special needs, or because that's so key. I mean, that's gonna help you. If that's being thoughtful, and it will help you in the long run. And when you're looking at bringing that meeting back to, particularly in our case, bringing that meeting back to a destination.
And Cheryl, I think it's one step further than getting to know your attendees, which refers to your sort of existing and known attendees, but creating environments that are so comfortable that more people are going to gravitate toward them, because the word gets out that says, well, this experience was so great because, and they might not even realize that it was things that were related to DE&I, but as we take these kind of measures to make the events more welcoming to all types of people, more are going to want to participate. And it could be our existing employees, right? If we noticed, you asked earlier, Barbara, about the after hours events, right? If we're creating after hours environments that are more comfortable for more people to participate,
the word
more
gets
will.
out. Right.
Right. So you don't only end up with a handful who are networking with senior management and others feel that they don't belong in that venue and not getting those same network and career growth opportunities because they feel, well, that's not a place for me, and they go to bed and they miss out on what might be actually happening after hours. So I think that's an interesting discussion about the after event pieces too.
Yeah. And taking this further beyond disabilities, I just wanted to add that in my handout, I also address the inclusivity of nursing mothers, or as we have more women entering the workforce and attending these meetings and events, let's be inclusive. If the venue doesn't already have a nursing pod or a room for mothers with a refrigerator for the milk, just add that. It's not a huge extra expense. Gender neutral restrooms is another way to be inclusive and all encompassing. So I'm curious for Cheryl, do you have those items already in the destinations?
So it's interesting. I've seen hotels here change into we've got, for instance, we've got gender neutral restrooms here in our office, but I've also seen some hotels change their restroom structure to accommodate and make them gender neutral for groups that are coming in, and that's an easy thing to do. I mean, just like we change it, just like we turn our if it's a women's group. And Hattie's very aware of this. We'll change the women's group, and we'll use the men's restrooms to accommodate the women, because normally you're going to have more women at a women's association, and right. So the same thing can be done with LGBTQ groups.
Yeah.
It should be a matter of course. There are probably things that are online that are already printed up, that decals and whatnot, correct, that you can just use. As we're sitting here, because I do plan events for meeting professionals. That is the other hat that I wear for Prevue's audience. I plan 3 or 4 summits a year. I'm thinking, wouldn't it be fabulous to have a summit that is a best practices in action of everything we're talking about here,
Yeah.
so that people can attend and see what we're talking about instead of us just talking about it. So that is in my in my mind, and if it's still there tomorrow.
I was going to say, put that on your to-do list, because here's the other thing I think we could really do to help each other right now through a best practice. There's best practices in DEI that starts before you or even arrive in the city, right? So I just attended a conference of CEOs. Before we arrived at the venue, we had this 2-page document around protocols for the pandemic. Here's what our rules are. And so I had to sit down and really go through those rules. And then it was, if you've been vaccinated, you go down one track. If you haven't, you go down another track. When we arrived at the hotel handled it perfectly. You were escorted to a room. You took a COVID rapid test. Then you were allowed to register, get your room key. But what we need now, because what's considered inclusion today was never even thought of 30 years ago when I went into this work, Barbara. So it's a wonderful time for the industry to come together, look at some best practices and say what's missing and how do we need to incorporate that. Cheryl and I sit constantly to look at the strategy for Visit Dallas, to think about how do we need to adjust that or customize it based on what's happening in the world that we're in today. So you're absolutely on point. That's how you should be thinking. Just let me know when the meeting's happening.
Yeah. Well, I think, unfortunately, a lot of what I read is a little too surfacey, and I, that's why we wanted to bring the people in who are, doing it every day, because it's just so important. We should touch on one, and I'm kind of going backwards now. I thought I had this in the correct order, but before the meeting even starts, there are other considerations around promotion and communication, and I'm curious to know some of your best practices there to make sure that the marketing materials and everything that you're doing to attract people to the meeting is giving that message that it is open and comfortable and welcoming event for people to attend. Leslie, once again, I see you nodding.
Well, as a global organization, it's easy for us to have a photographer in one of our meetings, and you can see the absolute diverse audience that comes to our meetings, women in hijabs and men and women and young people, older people from all around the world. So, but if you don't have that on your website, if you don't have that even in your social media feeds, you absolutely should. And I think in this day and age, our CVBs, destination marketing organizations, all are featuring everything that they can and should offer, but there are still some outliers there. I just did a demo for a vendor where all of the examples on the website demo that I was doing were white men. And I really just couldn't bite my tongue knowing that I was going to be on this webinar. And I just said, really? Is this what you're showing me? Because I don't see diversity. I don't feel included. I don't feel that others would be included. And that's my feedback. So, but I would defer to Cheryl here, because I would imagine that if you clicked on Visit Dallas right now, you would see so much more than just floor plans.
Yeah, absolutely, and that's a necessity at nowadays, because planners are going to be looking for, and you've got to look for the diversity of the city through their promotional. So it's funny, our marketing team can tell you that I'm always looking at what they're doing and hopefully making some good suggestions. I mean, they do. Our social media team does a phenomenal job of, as I said earlier, working with different bloggers and really highlighting things that are going on in the city. And so when you look at Visit Dallas's website, we've got a diverse section of the website that highlights the various things that basically highlights each of the markets. But you can certainly see the diversity in our promotion and communications material. From an LGBTQ video that we produced a few years ago, and so those kind of things are important as you start looking at as destinations in terms of the marketing and communication pieces.
So, do your clients take those and integrate them into their websites?
They do. They do.
They do.
Yeah. So they'll take pieces of that. Our marketing team will build microsites for the clients. And they'll take some of the information from our websites and build those into the microsites. I mean, you've got customers that want, what minority and women-owned businesses, restaurants do you have in your city? And we should be able to pull that information from, from our database and from our website, so they can actually see that and pull that onto there. We get a lot of those kind of requests now. Pull that into their promotion pieces as they market their meeting.
Right. And also, the huge thing we started seeing, Barbara, was that people would request a diversity of your vendors. They would request specific things in RFPs that we had to really step up our game to get ready for it. I was just laughing this weekend because we spent a lot of time going after the World Soccer, that's World Cup. And I was thinking,
pretty big.
Those requirements. We talk about global requirements, Leslie. Dallas had to step up with some global requirements because it's amazing. And all of that starts with the beginning of how do I customize this meeting and for what they're asking for.
Right.
Right. So the clients are sometimes driving the process.
They are.
Because they're so sophisticated and so much more micro about who they need to attract.
Yeah. I even had a client because they knew we had a diversity, equity, inclusion, department. Wanted me and some of our DEI committee members to look at their curriculum and how they are going to incorporate diversity, equity, inclusion into their. It was a university, but wanted to see how we could help them incorporate it into there. And so it takes time. You have to take time and read that and explain to them ways that they can help and give them ideas on ways that they can help implement diversity, equity, inclusion into their programs. And so you just got to, you really have to step back and, always, I've said this for the longest that, every client that we deal with, we're really having to at least try to figure out how do we customize the experience for their attendees. Because at the end of the day, it's all about the attendees and what we can bring to the table for the attendees that are coming into our destinations.
Cheryl, the example of curriculum is a really good scenario. A lot of times as planners, we might get the descriptions of the sessions given to us by different business partners. And if we just go ahead and plop them into our program agendas without carefully reviewing them, we may not be using inclusive language. Some of the things to make sure that we're avoiding jargon and too many abbreviations without explanations, which might make people feel that I don't fit here, I don't know what these terms are, for the people who might be newer to an industry and feel excluded that way, or people who haven't grown up with a certain type of education could be intimidated. The pronouns, we've all heard about the she, he, they, etc., but it's broader than that. It's using words to describe programs to make sure that they resonate with all. If we say that to complete this session, you're going to learn strong skills to do X, Y, and Z. Is strong really what it's about? Do we need to be strong or do we need to be effective? Is that a word that might resonate with more people? So there's simple little terminology. I was in a sales session the other day and they were using the examples of hunters and gatherers as the sales roles. And I said, what about finder, minder, binder as a sales role terminology? And they're like, yeah, that would work. I'm like, okay, because I feel better, because hunter doesn't really feel right in today's world to talk about that. Is fun. Some people find that offensive. So it goes even beyond the inclusive images to really digging into the terminology.
Right.
And some of that is so baked into the way people think. They're not even considering it, but got to be aware. And thankfully, we have people like you who are looking all of this material over. I have so many questions, so I think we should probably shift to our wonderful audience and see what they have to say. So Mary is here and asked, well, I did get a couple of comments. I won't read them all because there were 3 or 4 emails with the same gist, having to do with the meeting industry needing to be more diverse in the speakers they put on the stage, and that they don't represent the audience. So I think we all know that by now. And good for you for all reminding us. And I do see progress, and there's more progress to be made, but we've got to just keep having that home and asking, when we're asked to use a speaker, is there someone else? We've had so and so for 3 years now. Is there someone else, who can share your company's message, and not being afraid to do that? But let's get into this. Is a great question from Mary. What is your best piece of advice for getting started with DEI? I'm the chair of a nonprofit development board with no diversity at all, and we're beginning discussions on how to make the board more diverse. I'm the only woman on the board of all white men. Appreciate your advice. Anyone want to take that?
So I'll take that.
Okay.
I'd say first hire a DEI consultant to help you along the way. But no, seriously, because I was probably one of those people that came into the space and didn't, because coming from the strategic partnership side of the organization, but really having to learn the tactics and best practices behind diversity, equity, and inclusion. And I wouldn't trade it for the world. It is, but you really have to start having these discussions with your leadership. And I think Hattie would probably agree. It's having these discussions with your board chair, with your CEO, and making sure that they are they're all in doing this work, because that's going to be so key. And just having those discussions and letting them know what your intent is around diversity, equity, and inclusion, and then start building from there. But you really have to get buy-in from your from the leadership of your associations and organizations. And I think in this day and time, you've got more CEOs and boards understanding why this is so important and how it affects the and just keep in mind it affects the bottom line in what we do. So so that's kind of my 2 cents. Addie, you may want to.
Of course. Doing this work for so many years, Mary, I will tell you that, especially from the board level, we just instituted a DEI strategy for the Dallas Regional Chamber, and they did an excellent job of, you start at the board level, that you get the commitments, you get clear on what your framework is going to be, and then we hire the staff to support it. So if you're just getting started, having those best practices, if you're looking for experts, we know people who can help you. So please know that, so that you get it right the first time, you want to really look at what some of those industry best practices are.
And I'll jump in on this one as well. I don't know what type of association the question was coming from, but you could be in a situation, you don't want the existing board members to feel threatened or less than, to say, well, we don't need you anymore. So setting some realistic goals of what you're trying to get to without turning everything upside down overnight, and perhaps starting to talk about the idea of bench strength and building a forward-thinking plan and work with committees so that you get more people participating who are diverse, so that you've got that next group of people coming up, rather than feeling, oh, we're going to get rid of everybody that we have who's built this organization and put in a whole new team, because you might end up with a revolution on your hands if you don't approach it carefully.
Let me this, Sherry, because don't assume now that just because you're finally asking people of color to join, they want to, because they're being asked by a lot of other people right now to help them solve a problem that's a long-term problem. All of it starts with relationships. Who do you have a relationship with? Who do you know that can give you the expertise? Sit down and have a conversation and say, prior to us putting in doing the DEI work with the board and the CEO and I probably had probably a year and a half, Cheryl, worth of conversation about how we could make this work. And to Sherry's point, how not to alienate the rest of the board, how to be more inclusive, but how to put in best practices. At that point, no one in the industry was doing this work. So we had to go to other industries to find best practice. So just keep in mind that it's a process. It's not done overnight. And don't assume that because you say today, okay, now we want to diversify our association, that people are just going to show up and want to be a part.
Good point. Good point. Take the long view. I have a very specific question, but it's actually really interesting from Deirdre. Probably Leslie or Sherry, you might have experienced this. How do you handle someone who clearly requires something to make the event accessible to them, but does not provide this information until they get there on site? And what do you do with that type of situation? And is there any liability? Is there, can that come back to bite you?
I'll start there. So I've had this happen so many times where all of a sudden you need a Braille program book and tactile interpreter for someone who is both hearing and sight impaired. It's very hard to do it on the fly, but start with your surveys at the time of registration. I'm hearing more associations and companies with their database asking for this information as well. Do you require any accommodation? And then put your disclaimer there as well. We're not going to be able to do this unless you tell us in advance. But if it does happen on site, work with a local company. There are always scooter rental, wheelchair rental, all kinds of rental agencies throughout the destination. And again, work with your CVBs and your DMCs to identify that in advance, much like you would know where your local hospital is in case you have an emergency or an accident. But do your best to accommodate that, and try to find a sign language interpreter if you need that at the 11th hour by using those resources. But ask the questions in advance with a small disclaimer saying, we're going to do our best to accommodate you and make this meeting as inclusive as possible.
Okay. We have time for one more question, and this is the perfect one. From Ashley, are there any industry courses or certifications that you recommend where I can learn more about this topic?
Yeah, I'll take that one. Is it Ashley?
Ashley.
Yeah. So there are associations where you can actually go in and gain more knowledge on diversity, equity, and inclusion from. And I'm assuming that's what you're speaking of. From, for instance, here in Texas, there's a diversity council. There's a Texas Diversity Council, and I'm sure there's one in your in your state, because they're all across the country. And I started there and just kind of learning more about DEI. There's the conference board in New York is another one. They've got a whole diversity, equity, inclusion division. We can learn Diversity Inc. There's a lot of organizations out there that talk this language and do this for a living, and are willing to share best practices with individuals. So I would start locally, because there's organizations on a local level, even the chambers. I mean, we reached out to all of our minority and LGBT chambers because they've been in this space for quite some time, and they have agencies that they work with as well. And so if there's a local minority chamber in your area, don't hesitate to reach out to them because they can help.
Mm-hmm. The other thing that I would
go right ahead.
The other thing I would throw out is just looking up ADA accessibility for both physical and digital in particular, to pick up a lot of the very simple tips that can be done from those standpoints that we just aren't necessarily aware of.
Okay. Yeah, and on the ADA side, there's an association called Travelability, which is wonderful. And they're able to, I mean, they're very good at putting together best practices in travel and accessibility. So I've certainly reached out to them as well.
I'll put in a plug for Prevue to wrap it all up. We do have a section on our website on diversity. It's under meeting planning resources on the top bar. And there are some meeting industry certification programs and training programs that you can, very specific, that you can also sign up for. So on that note, we are just wrapping up our hour, and I can't thank you enough. What a lively, wonderful, informational hour this has been. So I'd like to thank Addie Hill, Sherry Lindenberg, thank you so much, Cheryl Richards, and Leslie Zeck for being a part of our webinar, and I hope to work with you all again. Thank you so much for your time to the audience, and have a great rest of your day.
Thank you, Barbara.
Thank you. Bye.
Thanks for having us.